It seems like everywhere you look these days, you see headlines about mental health and well-being, and I think a lot of our listeners are particularly concerned about the mental health of teenagers. It feels like a crucial piece of the puzzle, right?
It really is.
So for this deep dive, we are going to do a focused look at some data on a significant trend, that is depressive symptoms among young people, teens, right here in the U.S.
Yeah, we have some really insightful information to go over with you today, and it comes from the long-running Monitoring the Future study. And the psychologist Jean Twenge have really done a lot of great work in analyzing this data, and Data Dynamics is put into a really visual format for us. And what it tracks is how teenagers have been reporting symptoms of depression all the way from 1991, so several decades now, up to August of 2023.
Yeah, and what we want to do is not just throw a bunch of numbers at you, but we're going to try and really, look at what these trends might signify and explore some of the potential factors that might be at play here.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
So we're covering a lot of ground. We're not just going to be throwing numbers at you.
Yeah.
What we really want to do is understand what these trends mean
Right.
and explore some of the reasons that might be behind them.
Yes.
And one of the things that really jumps out when you look at this data is a significant difference between what girls are reporting and what boys are reporting. So let's kind of jump right into this and start with the early 90s.
Okay, so if we go back to kind of like 1991 to 1995,
Okay.
the initial picture shows that girls were already reporting higher levels of depressive symptoms compared to boys.
Okay.
So you're seeing rates of about 15 to 18% for girls.
Wow.
And then boys were reporting in the range of like 10 to 12%.
So even way back then, there was a pretty substantial difference.
Yeah.
It seems like during those early years, things stayed relatively consistent.
Yeah, that seems
Girls consistently reporting more symptoms than boys.
Uh-huh.
Then we get to the mid to late 90s, and it looks like maybe there's a little bit of a shift happening there.
Yeah, there is kind of a mild increase in the depressive symptoms that boys reported.
Okay.
And one potential explanation for that is that there was this growing awareness of mental health in general. And maybe this made it a little more okay for boys to actually say, yeah, I'm feeling this way,
Interesting.
and report those feelings. Then for girls, you see kind of a little up and down, but it stayed generally higher than boys throughout that time.
So that's really interesting about boys becoming a little bit more aware.
Yeah.
Now, as we move into like the early 2000s, let's say like 2000 to 2010,
Okay.
what are we seeing there?
So in that decade, you're seeing a gradual but steady increase in the percentage of boys reporting these depressive symptoms. And by around 2010, that number had climbed to about 15 to 16%.
Got it.
But then at the same time, girls are following a similar upward trend.
Okay.
So the reports are also increasing slowly, but remaining in the high teens.
So both groups are going up.
Yeah.
But that initial gap is still there,
Uh-huh.
right? And now we get into the 2010s, and it seems like this is really where things start to change quite a bit.
Yeah, the early 2010s do seem to be this kind of turning point.
Yeah.
You see rates increasing for both boys and girls,
Okay.
but the pace is much more rapid for girls.
Yeah.
There's a real surge in their reports of depressive symptoms starting around this time. And by the mid-2010s, this acceleration becomes even more obvious.
Okay.
You can really see it in the data.
Now, this is when we start to see another really big shift happening, and that's the rise of the smartphone.
Yeah.
Everyone's getting smartphone now, teenagers included.
Right. And it's interesting because right around 2012, for the first time, more than half of the teenagers in the U.S. own a smartphone.
Wow. Okay.
And researchers have observed this correlation between this rise in smartphone ownership and the increase in adolescent depression.
Yeah.
And this link seems particularly strong for girls.
So it's not to say that one causes the other.
Right, exactly. Correlation isn't causation.
But it does make you think.
Yeah, it really does.
So now let's jump forward to the most recent data. So we're talking about after 2019 all the way up to August 2023.
Okay.
What's happening there?
So this data shows this really concerning peak in these reports of depressive symptoms.
Okay.
And by 2023, you're looking at about 40% of girls
Wow.
and around 25% of boys reporting significant depressive symptoms.
So that's a huge jump from even a decade earlier.
Yeah, it really...
You can't talk about this period without talking about COVID,
Of course not.
the pandemic.
Right, the pandemic and all the disruptions that came with it,
Yeah.
the isolation, the changes in daily routine, just increased uncertainty in general.
Yeah,
It really had a big impact on the well-being of adolescents.
of course.
And another really interesting point is that during this time, 2020 to 2022, youth mental health hotlines across the country saw this huge increase in calls.
Oh, wow.
And a really noticeable thing was that a much higher proportion of those calls were coming from people who identified as female.
Wow. So it seems like girls were really hit hard during this period.
It seems that way, yeah.
Okay, so let's dive in a little bit deeper into this difference between girls and boys
Okay.
and why we might be seeing this more significant increase in girls' reports of depressive symptoms.
Sure.
Let's start with biological factors.
Okay, so, during puberty, there are all these hormonal changes, and these can actually have an influence on mood.
Yeah.
And for girls, these fluctuations in estrogen and progesterone levels can actually increase their biological sensitivity to depression. And this is especially true when they're combined with other stressors.
Makes sense.
So it's not the whole story,
Right.
but it's definitely a piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so it's not just biological, obviously. We
Yeah.
also have to think about societal pressures.
Yes, and I think this is a big one
Huge.
for all teens, but maybe especially for girls in certain ways.
Yeah. What are some of those?
Well, teenage girls face a lot of pressure around their body image,
Yeah.
social connections, and how well they're doing in school.
Uh-huh.
And the rise of social media has really amplified these pressures
Of course.
because
Yeah.
they're constantly exposed to these very curated and often unrealistic images of other people.
Yeah, it's all so perfect.
Yeah, and this can really impact self-esteem
Sure.
and contribute to mental health struggles, particularly for girls.
And since we're talking about social media,
Yeah.
what about cyberbullying?
Yeah, this seems like another area where girls are maybe more affected.
It seems like it.
Yeah, the research suggests that girls are more likely to be the targets of cyberbullying and harassment online.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of aggression can be so damaging.
Mm-hmm.
It can really make those feelings of depression and anxiety so much worse.
Yeah.
And while boys experience this too,
Sure.
it might look different for them.
Okay.
How it affects them emotionally might be different.
Mhm.
And they might not always express it the same way or even recognize the impact in the same way.
So they're both dealing with this stuff,
Yeah.
but in different ways almost. Now,
Mhm.
what about teenage boys?
Yeah.
They're facing a lot of pressure too, right?
Yes.
This whole expectation around masculinity, maybe hesitation to show vulnerability.
Yes. That's so important to think about.
Yeah.
Because, boys often feel like they need to hide their emotions.
Yeah, be tough.
Yeah, project this image of strength and toughness.
Mm-hmm.
And this can make it much harder for them to admit that they're struggling or to reach out for help.
And so it might not even be that they're experiencing less,
Right.
but that they're just expressing it in a different way.
Exactly. Or maybe turning it inward.
And this kind of leads into that topic of help-seeking behavior.
Yes, definitely.
Are girls just more likely to seek help?
Well, historically, girls have been more likely to talk about their emotions
Mm-hmm.
and seek help for mental health challenges
Yeah.
compared to boys.
Okay.
And this difference in help-seeking behavior could also be contributing to these higher rates of reported depression in girls.
Makes sense.
If you're more likely to talk about it and ask for support,
Yeah.
you're more likely to actually get that help.
Right, and have it documented.
Exactly.
So it seems like it's this combination of things.
Yeah.
Maybe they are experiencing some things more, and then they're also more likely to seek help.
Mhm.
But now let's zoom out a little bit.
Okay.
Because we've been talking about this difference between genders,
Yeah.
but the overall trend for both boys and girls is up. So what are some of the broader reasons behind this general increase in teen depression?
So there are a bunch of things at play here.
Okay.
One is the pressure that teens face at school
Yeah.
and in their extracurriculars.
There's just so much pressure to achieve.
So much pressure to get into the best colleges,
Yeah.
and this can lead to really intense schedules and just being overscheduled in general.
Yeah, it's burnout city.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, we also have to think about how families and their social structures have changed.
Yeah, that's true.
Parents are often really busy,
Uh-huh.
and then you add in digital communication.
Yeah, everyone's on their devices.
Right. And this means less actual face-to-face time
Yeah.
and less in-person support for these teens.
And that can make them feel pretty lonely, I imagine.
For sure.
And of course, we have to bring back social media.
Yeah.
It's not just about cyberbullying.
Right.
It's about this constant comparison.
Exactly. You're always seeing this really perfect picture of other people's lives. And, especially for girls, this can lead to them constantly comparing themselves to others,
Yeah.
which can really hurt their self-esteem and ultimately contribute to depression.
And it's important to remember just how much time they're spending on social media.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah, what is it, like 7 to 9 hours a day on average?
7 to 9 hours outside of schoolwork.
That's a lot.
It's a huge amount of time in a space that can really increase anxiety.
But, we did talk about this whole idea of self-reporting earlier.
Yeah.
Is it possible that part of this increase we're seeing is just because young people are more willing to talk about mental health?
It's definitely a possibility.
Okay.
Mental health is becoming a lot less stigmatized.
That's good.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
And people are talking about it more openly.
Yeah.
So maybe more teens feel comfortable saying, yeah, I'm struggling with this,
Okay.
and this is a good thing.
Of course.
But it does mean that it's kind of hard to compare data from today with data from like 30 years ago.
Right, because maybe it wasn't being talked about as much.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe there is more distress, but maybe there's also just more openness about it.
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination.
Now, I want to go back to this gap between girls and boys.
Uh-huh.
Even though boys' rates are increasing too, that difference is getting bigger.
Yeah, and that's a really important thing to think about
Yeah.
because it's saying that even though both groups are struggling,
Yeah.
it seems like something is really hitting girls harder.
Yeah, like there are things that are affecting girls more than boys.
It seems that way, yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today.
We have.
Let's just recap a little bit.
Okay.
We're seeing this really clear increase in depressive symptoms among teens in the U.S.,
Yeah.
and it's way more pronounced for girls.
Yes.
And this is creating this growing gap between genders.
Oh.
And it seems like a lot of this is due to things like social media and the pressures that come with it,
Yeah.
societal pressures in general, changes in families and how they connect,
Yeah.
and of course the pandemic.
Yeah, that was a big one.
And it's so important to understand these patterns
Yes.
and this difference between girls and boys
Uh-huh.
because it means that we need different approaches to help.
Right, what works for one group might not work for another.
Yeah, exactly. So for girls, we might think about addressing social media pressures
Yeah.
and promoting a healthy body image
Uh-huh,
and just supporting them in navigating relationships.
Those are also important.
And then for boys, maybe we need to focus on normalizing emotions and encouraging them to seek help and, challenging some of those more traditional ideas about masculinity.
Okay.
So it's really about creating spaces where all teenagers feel supported.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to.
So this has been a really informative deep dive.
It has.
It's clear that this whole issue of teen mental health is really complex.
It is.
And it's constantly evolving.
Mm.
And this data is really telling us that this is something we need to be paying attention to.
We really do.
So as we wrap up, here's a final thought for you.
Okay.
Technology is changing so fast
Yeah.
and social norms are shifting.
Mm.
So how do you think these trends in teen depression, especially that gap between girls and boys,
Yeah.
how is that going to continue to change in the coming years?
Yeah, it's something to really think about.
And what can we do right now to help the teenagers of the future?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.